Movies are good. And for the first time, y'all would say, where have you been? We've been waiting for you. So welcome this evening. Thank you so much for being here. We are, if you don't know, are a primarily non-fiction bookstore. We've been in business. Oh, we have to go there. I have a little story to tell.
Want to stay here?
Yeah, yeah. She's prettier. Okay. So we are primarily a nonfiction bookstore. We've been in business for 33 years here in the city of Detroit. We've been in this neighborhood for 20 years. We were first across the street, and then they said this building got built, and they said they wanted experienced merchants. And I said, that would be me. So we got our wagons and trucks and boxes and bundles, and we moved from across the street over here to the part that's there in 2013. And set up shop there. So it was after the pandemic when things began to happen all over the world. And we had to acquiesce to technology and go and create an online store. So that's what we did. And as a result, our business has changed for the better. As a result of that, we were able to take over this space where the green wall is. Last September, they came and started the demolition. Now, they gave me a sledgehammer and said, take out that wall. And I said, you do it. But in about 2 or 3 weeks, the demolition crew and the construction crew had finished. And now we have another space that we're learning to live in. So tonight, you all are helping us learn to live in a new way. That's the impact of the pandemic on all of us. We're learning to live in a new way and with new things. I heard someone speak on Canadian radio the other day, and they said this: policies are not changing people as fast enough as technology. Technology is causing the changes. Look at us. Who would have thought 33 years ago that we'd be on the TV, in the chair, somebody there, all of you here? That's a big change, and technology is making it happen. So I welcome all of you tonight to Source Booksellers, high tech Source Booksellers, and our lovely speakers this evening on this wonderful book that you're going to hear about. So Allison, I'm turning it over to you.
So I'm so excited that we're hosting this during the release week for Organize, Fight, and Win. When I first got our copy of it, I was like, ooh, who could I ask? How could they get here? So just our luck. Dr. Cherise Burden Scully is here in Detroit teaching at Wayne State University in Africana Studies. African-American Studies. And so just not far from, Wayne State is not far from this store. So we were able to have her in store for this discussion. So this is quite a delight. And we have Dr. Dean, Jordy Dean here from, where are you?
Geneva, New York.
In New York. And I think I had up what I was going to say, and then it's gone. So we'll do like a little bio. You are a professor
of
where?
Political science at Hobart and William Smith colleges.
At Hobart and William
Smith colleges, yeah.
Awesome. And so how did you two get to collaborate for this book?
Well, so first of all, we met at an event in Seattle called Red May. And then after hearing Cherise speak, because she did a couple of different presentations at this event, I invited her to give a lecture at Hobart William Smith. And so that was really fun and great. And then, sometime within a year or so after that, I was looking up a text from Louise Thompson Patterson and couldn't find it anywhere. And so I asked Charisse, because she knows, she has archived so many things, knows all of these different texts. And I was pretty sure she would have it. And she was surprised that she didn't have it. And so she starts asking around, and then we realize, oh, wow, like this is actually really, really hard to find, and it shouldn't be that hard. Louise Thompson Patterson was a major figure and major organizer, along with many other people who we'll talk about tonight, and it shouldn't be this hard to find this work. And so then we started putting it together.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So today we're hosting this event, co-hosting it with the General Baker Institute, which is a fantastic institute here in Detroit. And okay, and Carolyn from the institute is here.
Let me see, I was talking to you earlier.
Hi.
And we're honored to be able to co-host hopefully many events with Source. This is our first, so thank you to Source for having us as a co-host, and we're honored to be here for this awesome book.
And where can we find you online?
GeneralBakerInstitute.com or .org.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So you want to stay connected, and you may even get a t-shirt. Okay. So I think what we're gonna do maybe is it gonna be like you're gonna speak and then.
So Jody will start.
Okay.
Speak about 10 minutes and I will.
Wonderful, and we'll do questions and we'll do questions after. All right.
Great. Thanks so much. So it's really exciting to be here, also particularly during the launch week of this book. It's just great to have the book finally out. I want to begin by saying the names of all of the women who are collected in this volume, in part just so that people have an idea of the expanse of the authors we've collected, and also because their names need to be said more and more and not kind of sort of forgotten. So Grace Campbell, Williana Burroughs, Maud White Katz, Tyra Edwards, Ella Baker, Marvel Cook, Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Elma Dale, Claudia Jones, Vicki Garvin, Islanda Good Robeson, Dorothy Hunton, Lorraine Hansberry, Alice Childress, Dorothy Burnham, Yvonne Gregory, and Charlotta Bass. My guess is that people have probably heard of a few of these, but probably very few of us have heard of all of them. But now, thanks to this volume, this is going to change. I will say also that this collection is not exhaustive. There are a number of people who also could have been included in it, but for reasons of space, we couldn't include everybody that we wanted to. We had to make some really hard choices. So one of the ways that we kind of tried to bracket the amount of material was by limiting the time. So the time period of the book goes from 1919 to 1956. If the book went past 1956, you would of course heard names like Angela Davis mentioned, because she would be in a more contemporary book, and maybe in the future there will be a more contemporary book. Also, the authors we've collected are from are anchored around the Communist Party of the United States. And so it's more of a U.S. centric book, though, as you'll see, all of the writers are very internationalist in their focus and in their politics. We also made some choices regarding making sure that we had primarily nonfiction nonfiction pieces. Again, if the book had a book which was collecting the influential writings of Black communist women, could also have made choices for more literary pieces, more poem pieces, but we decided to, again, for sort of reasons of space and consistency, to focus on nonfiction, not exclusively, but primarily. I mentioned earlier that we came to, that Sharice and I started putting this together because we saw a real need here. We got a lot of help on this book. So we put it together during COVID, and one of the benefits to us doing it during COVID is my daughter was at home from college because all the colleges closed, and so she had nothing to do. So she typed the whole manuscript, and we had to do all that. She had to do all this typing because most of the texts that we got were coming from like microfiche or just Xeroxes of magazines or Xerox of typescript that Minka Makalawi got for us from this archives in Moscow. So everything had to be retyped in order to be put together as a book. So thanks to Sadie for doing that. The other great thing about Sadie doing this typing for us is that she was very excited, and like I would see her in there snapping her fingers and sometimes putting tweets out with quotes from the women she was writing because she was so inspired. And that to me was really it let me know that this was going to be a really exciting book. We should also give a shout out to Adam McNeil, who secured permissions for us, and that was really helpful. And there were a whole number of scholars who helped out. I'm not going to mention all of those names. Maybe Sharice might mention some later on, but we mentioned them in the book, and we're really grateful to their work. So as I mentioned, the kinds of things that we've collected here include political analyses, speeches, newspaper and magazine articles. And what they do, particularly when you read them all together, or when you see them collected, is it gives us a dramatically different view of what Black organizing looks like in the first half of the 20th century, what women's organizing looks like, and what the Communist Party looks like. And the primary difference is that these things aren't separate. They are one thing. They are all together. They strengthen and inform and enable each other rather than being efforts of political work and fights against oppression that are separate. They start out together. So one of the things that you see is that the Communist Party of the United States is put together and built in part by the organizing work of Black women like Grace Campbell and Williana Burrow in the 20s, and then a whole slew of other people in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? It's not this separate organization that just has, just sort of like white men quoting Lenin all the time. It's in fact organizing, Black women doing tenants organizing and going to court on behalf of women arrested for prostitution, fighting around for relief, fighting for the Scottsboro Boys when they're falsely accused of raping a couple of white women. This is what Communist Party organizing looks like when you take it from the perspective of these Black communist women. So this is it. So it's inspiring to see these movements building each other, part of a unified struggle against oppression rather than something separate. So one of the things that's crucial, I think, to both of us about the book is that it has lessons for organizers and theoretical lessons, right? All together, right? Lessons for organizers and lessons for that are theoretical. So the sort of bottom line organizer lessons are, you got to be in an organization, right? These women are, not all of them, many of them are members of the Communist Party. Other ones form new organizations like Sojourners for Truth and Justice. They form peace organizations. They're part of organized political struggle. Political struggle is not something you do just all by yourself. It requires organized work with others. They also, in their organizing work, identify and amplify patterns of oppression and resistance. and they identify and amplify patterns that go that are all over the world, right? So geographical patterns, what's happening in Spain, what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in China. These things are related to what's happening in the United States, particularly in the South. And the resistance that people find all over the world also can inspire resistance to forms of oppression in the United States. So this identifying and amplifying the patterns is something really crucial to their organizing work. And then the third aspect is that that's together with basically organizing and identifying, amplifying patterns is aiming for unity, right? They are one of the things that one sees when you read all of these women's work together is that their goal is building a mass unified struggle, right? And the goal, and this is always done by emphasizing opportunities for unity. With respect to some of the theoretical lessons of the book, we get compelling theories of anti-fascism and analyses of anti-fascism. We get an emphasis on the importance of Black self-determination. And we get a theory of triple oppression or triple exploitation. All of these theoretical contributions they're deeply theoretically important, and they're also important back for the organizing. For example, the theory of Black self-determination developed as an account of the struggles within the Black belt, or the right of self-determination for Black people in the Black belt. That's crucial because it emphasizes that white people have to be involved in the fight for Black liberation. And some of the other pieces emphasize that men have to be involved in rejecting male chauvinism, right? And both of these things are important, not for their own sake, but also for the class struggle, because the class struggle and the struggle against imperialism depends on building the working class, and the working class includes white women, Black women, white men, Black men, and everybody, and white and Black workers. So the theoretical lessons that they give us are deeply entwined with their activism. One last thing I'll emphasize before I hand over to Charisse is that the book is, we organize the book chronologically. And we do that for a couple of reasons. The one is that most of the pieces do multiple things. So a piece that seems like it's about domestic work might make a number of international connections. And so it didn't make sense to separate it and say, this is just, about domestic workers. They're making international connections. And also you can see the patterns of oppression and resistance stretch over time. I mean, there is problems with racist policing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And there is resistance to this in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's not something that just emerges at one, as a more recent thing. It's consistent with the experiences that Black people have had in the United States. So the book is organized chronologically. The first section, as I mentioned, focuses on the kind of formative years and features Grace Campbell and Williana Burroughs. And the second section features the kind of early years of labor militancy. And those pieces tend to look at unionization efforts. They're all pretty much set roughly in this long period of the Depression, but unionization efforts, domestic workers, and then the very famous piece, or the article on the Bronx slave market, as well as an excerpt from Esther Cooper Jackson's master's thesis on the Negro women domestic worker. So both of those are, these pieces on domestic worker organizing, I think, are particularly important for us now, as we see how organizers dealt with groups that were necessary for building the working class, but also seemed very difficult to organize because they were separate. So I'll hand this back over to Charisse.
Okay, thank you so much, Jody. Oh no, feedback. Anyway, so thank you all so much for being here. This is like Super Bowl numbers, just kidding. But I'm happy to see some of my students here. And yeah, I'm just so excited for this book launch. This is just such an important work. Just holding it in my hand. It's like, this was a lot of work. And it's I think one of the most important things that I've worked on because of the way that I think that it will resonate not only within academia, but beyond academia as well. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just want to go over the last sort of 3 sections of the book and just say a little bit about them and then read an excerpt from each of those sections. So part 3 really conveys the ways that anti-fascism was really integral to the types of organizing in which these women engaged. But they didn't understand fascism only as a European phenomenon. They fundamentally understood that the fight against fascism had to be ongoing in the context of the United States, not least because Jim Crow and white supremacy here, even after World War II, when the US was ostensibly fighting for democracy and equality, the discrimination and the oppression of Black people was still very much ongoing and was a marker of the ways that that fascism had not disappeared simply because World War II had ended. And they also mentioned the ways that imperialism was absolutely ingrained in fascism, that these two were inextricable, that as long as imperial relationships continue to dominate the world, especially US imperialism, that fascism would always be a constant threat. And so that's a really important takeaway from that section. And so I'll just read a section from a piece by Thelma Dale, who was another prominent woman within the CPUSA. And this piece is called The Status of Negro Women in the United States. And it was written in 1947. And this piece is important because even though Black people had made some gains during World War II, these gains were being systematically rolled back because of, in the context of demobilization. And this was concomitant with the rise in racial terrorism against Black people. And these two things combined reflected, again, the needs for an ongoing struggle against fascism. So she wrote that, you know, today, with reaction becoming increasingly entrenched in America, women are finding it more difficult to maintain their position in the political life of our country. This year, for example, only 7 women were elected to Congress of the United States. 4 of these women were elected by Republicans, and already some of these Republican ladies are showing that they are tools of reactionaries. Although they were elected on a presumed progressive platform, no Negro woman has ever been elected to the Congress of the United States. As far as we can determine, there are no Negro women in elected posts on either a state or municipal level at the present. So no Black women are in government. And what that means is that even though Black women bear the brunt of the intersection of oppression and exploitation, they have no political power, no form of political power to remedy those positions. And that is why organizing is so important. That's why grassroots organizing in particular is very important, because that's the way that Black women can wield any sort of control over their life chances. And then she goes on to say that the almost total absence of Negro women from posts in the government is due in part to the fact that the majority of the 6 million Negro women in the United States live in the 13 southern states where disenfranchisement through white supremacy laws and other legal entanglements deny millions of American citizens the free exercise of the right to vote. The poll tax, which exists as a requirement for voting in 7 southern states, robs 10 million citizens of the right to vote, 6 million whites and 4 million Negroes. So here she's making the connection between disenfranchisement and white supremacy. And of course, these two, the sort of the abrogation of political rights and then racial domination are key aspects of fascism, right? This is precisely what the United States was supposed to be fighting against, and yet and still these things persist in the United States. And so here, the other thing that we see is, even though Black women are the subject of analysis, it's not in an identity reduction way. It's not only about Black women or only about sort of liberation for Black women. They're using Black women as a means by which to show all of the pervasive forms of oppression. But as you see, she's also very much concerned about the 6 million whites who are oppressed in the South and who are disenfranchised by very similar systems. And so even as the relationship of Black women to the mode of production is important, it's important in the service of the broader proletarian struggle. So the next section, section 4, has to do with peace. And this is not peace in like a kumbaya sense. So peace in this radical tradition is not the absence of conflict, but it is absolutely foundational to both liberation, generally Black liberation particularly, and socialism, because of the ways that war and imperialism and disinvestment in social welfare and the manufacturing of consent are instrumental in maintaining the status quo. And it's a status quo in which Black people, women, and Black women, along with other oppressed people, continue to enjoy a much worse life than the very tiny, predominantly white male ruling class, right? And so the manufacturing of consent is really important because in context of war, this is when the government will tell us we need to close ranks, we all need to fall in line under patriotism. And this tends to be the time when people are more willing to give up their rights. And if it is that we're constantly in a state of war, so the US basically moved seamlessly from World War II to the Korean War. The Korean War started in 1950, then you're in a constant state of repression. And this was something that women, that the Black women in this text took seriously. And so now I'll read a piece called "A Legal Conference Shows Peace is Key to Freedom" by Lorraine Hansberry. And this was written in 1952 in Freedom magazine. And I'll just say before I read this, many of the selections in this section are, from Freedom newspaper, not Freedom magazine. And Freedom is such an important resource. So Freedom newspaper, it's all digitized. It's digitized and it's available on the NYU website. So I highly recommend everybody read it. It's a newspaper that was started by Paul Robeson and Louis Burnham. And it was an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, Black, a paper that sort of lifted up the experiences of Black folks as well as working folks. And it was only in existence for about 4 years because of attack by the US government, because of constant underfunding, but it is such an important resource. It is one of the earliest papers to cover the anti-apartheid struggle. So we tend to think, for example, that the anti-apartheid struggle started in the 1950s. Or excuse me, in the 1980s. This is 1950 and 1951 that they're talking about the anti-apartheid struggle. So it's just a really important resource. But Lorraine Hansberry, and this is also important. I'm gonna get to the piece, I swear, but like most people know Lorraine Hansberry from like A Raisin in the Sun, right? She has a sort of bourgeois background, but like Lorraine Hansberry was with it. Like Lorraine Hansberry was an actual radical. Like we have this sanitized notion of many people like Lorraine Hansberry, like W.B. Du Bois, because of what I call intellectual McCarthyism. People try to separate them from their radicalism, their communism, their socialism, their anti-imperialism, their anti-war stances to make them palatable to the status quo, right? They try to liberalize them to make it so that or that they just erase them outright. But so many of the people that are celebrated for their art or culture were also radicals. They were revolutionary. So even Langston Hughes, for example. And so I just wanted to mention that about Lorraine Hansberry. So she wrote, up and down the Americas, some people have already been murdered, scores have been tortured, thousands have been imprisoned, and thousands more have fled their homelands in exile. Throughout Latin America, the interventionist policies of the United States government has made the very word peace illegal. In Brazil, a young woman was murdered in the streets. A young boy had instruments of torture placed under his gums because he collected signatures for peace. In Argentina, no one may organize for peace without fear of imprisonment. When all nations and all people need it so desperately, peace in the Americas is illegal. So, and this is a little bit mind-boggling, right? Peace, right? That this is a source of like government and state repression. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois was indicted by the United States government in 1951 as an agent of a foreign power because he was a member of an organization called the Peace Information Center. And because they circulated something called the Stockholm Peace Petition or the Ban the Bomb Petition. And so he was considered to be an agent of a foreign power because he was pushing for international peace. So then what does that say about the United States, right? If peace is subversive, if it is threatening to national security, if it's a form of destabilization, then what does that say about the US and its will to war and its fundamental investment in violence and you know, the military industrial complex, right? So a lot of the intricacies of peace and how peace means and into imperialism and into colonialism and into racism, you know, and into economic exploitation, a lot of that becomes apparent in this particular section of the text. And finally, the last section of the text is about sort of anti-communism and white supremacy. And anti-communism is really important. Everybody doesn't have to be a communist or socialist. That's not the point, but we must be against anti-communism because what these people convey is that anti-communism is inextricable from anti-Black racial oppression, and it is inextricable from white supremacy. Anti-communism is used as a weapon to not only reinscribe racial hierarchy, but to also render struggles for civil rights and for Black equality as subversive and seditious, right? So one example that I often give, so my research is really about these intersections of anti-radicalism and anti-Blackness, but one example of this is that in the 1930s, there's something called the Fish Committee. And one of the questions that would be asked in the Fish Committee to see if people were communists was if they had ever had like a Negro in their home.
Yep.
And if you had a Negro in your home, then you were suspected of being a communist. But what this also says about the CPUSA is that contrary to the belief that it's this lily white organization, it shows that they were the ones who were interracial organization. They challenged Jim Crow unions, Jim Crow shops before it was popular, right? That they were willing, willing to have Black people enter into the party on an equal basis in the 1920s and 1930s, right? Which is why if you were an N-word lover, then you were suspected of being a communist, right? And again, what does this say about the United States? If your belief in Black equality makes you a stooge of Moscow, right? Or makes you this, you know, wild-eyed red, then what does that say about the United States, which is ostensibly, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the other thing that's conveyed in this section is how the Smith Act, which is the Alien Registration Act passed in 1940, and then the McCarran Act, which is the Internal Security Act of 1950, were key tools of using anti-communism to shut down rights for everybody. So people who were communists, people who were fellow travelers, people who were suspected communists, people who who had a Paul Robeson CD and therefore they could be called a communist. Mm-hmm. And it was a tool to deport people if they were members of a communist party or were accused to be so. So Claudia Jones got deported. Many people, Claudia Jones, CLR James he left, but he was about to be deported. He was on Ellis Island. People had their passports taken away. So like Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, all of these, Marbell Cook, they all had their passports taken away. So they couldn't travel abroad for many years. People were thrown in jail for many reasons, right? And so this section of the text bears that out. And so I'll just end by reading a section from, I'm not done, sorry. But I'll end this part of my rant with an excerpt from a piece called This Is My Husband, Fighter for His People, Political Refugee, which is written by Esther Cooper Jackson, because her husband, James Jackson, who was a leader in the Communist Party, was forced underground. And so she writes this pamphlet to shed light on how the Smith Act and the McCarran Act, it doesn't just affect the people who are targeted by it or are forced underground or are imprisoned. It also affects the families. It affects their children. It affects communities. It affects everybody. And it affects our ability to relate to each other because everybody's turned into a snitch, right? A snitch or a coward. So you're either telling or you're too afraid to associate with your neighbors or other people for fear of being accused of anything, right? So there is this phenomenal reality of fear. So she writes, you know, the war drive of the rulers of America and their assault against civil liberties led to increased attacks upon Negro leaders and the Negro people as a whole. It matters not whether they are communists, non-communists, or anti-communists. Negro leaders are being persecuted as dangerous subversives, threatened, jailed, deported, lynched. In the forefront of these leaders are the Smith Act victims, such as Benjamin J. Davis, who was then serving a 5-year prison term in the Jim Crow Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary, and Henry Winston, who was also a political refugee. She goes on to say that the conviction of the 11 leaders of the Communist Party was quickly followed by the indictment and arrest of dozens of others. Among them were the Negro leaders Claudia Jones, Pettis Perry, and her husband, James Jackson. Jack and several others chose to find a way to continue their struggle for peace and democracy in spite of the fascist-like law under which they were indicted. So here she's saying, again, she's saying that she's showing the deep connections between anti-communism and anti-Blackness, because it's Black leaders who are the sort of outsized victims of this targeting, because of the ways that the struggle for civil rights and Black rights was construed as communist. So it's not only a means of destroying communism or socialist organizing in the United States, it's also a means of destroying any struggle for racial equality. And then by extension, it threatens everybody's rights, you know, everybody's civil liberties, because anybody can be accused and could be sort of ground at this gristmill of anti-communism. So those are the sections of the text. And then the last thing I'll just say is, as I mentioned, like, we definitely want this text to reach beyond academia. Even though Jody and I are academics, we're also members of organizations, and we also use our position as academics to sort of redistribute knowledge and to democratize access to knowledge. And so our book, we hope that this collection is reflective of that. But some of the takeaways that resonate beyond academia from this text is, number one, as Jody said, join an organization. And not only any organization, an organization committed to revolutionary transformation, which relates to the second point, is that you have to engage in principled struggle in the organization. There are going to be contradictions in every organization because we live in a patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist society. So every organization is going to have that. But what these women convey is that you engage in principled struggle within your organization, and not to destroy the organization, not to for your sort of position to win out over and above everybody else, but to hold the organization to its ethical to its ethical ideals, right? To make the organization better. It is really important to do that. And so there's a different examples of Black women engaging in that ethical struggle. The third is that repression is real and it's ubiquitous, but we can get through it, and we can withstand it through mutual comradeship, through mutual support, through staying, like, to use a colloquial term, like 10 toes down in your organization, that you're going to be stronger together. And you're going to be able to withstand those attacks and protect your comrades and your loved ones if there's strength in numbers, right? The next thing is that what we convey with this text is that there's all different sites of knowledge production. It's not just academic books, and it's probably not primarily academic books. A lot of those books are trash, but sites of knowledge production include newspapers, committee reports, pamphlets, fiction, poetry, speeches, that all of these are sites of knowledge production. And so we have to rethink, like, who counts as an intellectual, who counts as a knowledge producer. It's not just people with PhDs. It's not just people in, the Ivory or Ebony Tower or whatever. Like, it is people who are creating theory, grounded theory, who are creating concepts and frameworks and ideas that are to the end of education for liberation. And then the final thing, is that, like, we call this book Organized Fight Win. We have to remember that, like, we will win. It's fascism outside, but we will win. And these women understood this, like people like Esther Cooper Jackson and Dorothy Burnham and Louise Thompson Patterson were long distance revolutionaries. They were still organizing and still doing work into their 80s and 90s. Esther Cooper Jackson just passed away at the age of 105 in August. Dorothy Burnham is still alive, right? So we have to keep that, like Fidel Castro says, you know, revolutionaries are always optimistic. Like we have to keep it close that we will win, you know, because that is what sort of that will continue people to do this work that is often thankless and that is under attack, but we'll win. So it's worth it. That's it.
So this is a good time for some questions. Do we have any questions here? And then we're going to check online. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Given the things that you've talked about with the struggle back in those days,
Mm-hmm.
do you think those contain any lessons for today? And where do you think we are today in terms of a lot of those issues that you talked about?
Mm-hmm. We're down bad. We down bad because the thing to understand too, and this is why I think that the focus on like the 30s and sort of the 40s and even that 50s moment kind of resonates with today, because they were down bad too. Like the 60s and 70s, we often give a lot of attention to the 60s and 70s. And that was a moment of profound optimism because of the correlation of forces, right? This is when the global South was on the march. We had like the Group of 77, we had the Non-Aligned Movement, we had the Tricontinental. There was a fundamental, it seemed imminent that like imperialism was going to fall, right? We're not in that moment. You know, we're in a moment when war, you know, World War III seems like inevitable. Like we're at war. We're constantly at war. Even before the Ukraine situation, we were still at war. Sanctions are low intensity warfare. Okay. Drone strikes those are forms of warfare. The United States has 800 bases around the world. That is the sort of the framework for war. And so I think we're in a very tough situation, but I think that more and more people are joining the ranks of the sufferers. And that is what sort of like raises consciousness, right? And so, for example, like there's a lot of talk about fascism right now. But what Aimé Césaire reminds us is that fascism is a term that gets used when white people start getting treated like the colonized. Mm-hmm. But what that also says is that whatever people are calling it, they're realizing their material conditions are deteriorating rapidly. And we have two choices. I think, as Rosa Luxemburg said, it's like socialism or barbarism. But now is that interregnum, so to speak, right? So Gramsci has that statement where he says, you know, like the old is dead, the new is struggling to be born, and now is the time of monsters. That's called the interregnum, and that's where we are. So it could go either way, but that's why you need to order. Jody, did you want to?
Dr. Dean, where in the text did you find?
Oh, she gonna.
No, go ahead.
Where in the text did you find thoughts or writings around that reflect? I have to get my thought together. The Marxist-Leninist tone.
Well, let's say Claudia Jones and Thelma Dale were party leaders, and they're writing in political affairs, and so the first thing is like they have the kind of Marxist-Leninism is like the undercurrent or the set of assumptions. It's not like they feel like they have to go on and cite Marx to prove that they're good communists, or that they have to give some sort of long excursus on Lenin. They do from time to time mention, different, I don't know, they mention Stalin from time to time. I'll just put it out there. And so, and Lenin from time to time. But it's not like they're not, we didn't select pieces where folks are giving their own, or they're giving some sort of doctrinaire treatise on a classic figure. We were using things that are putting their convictions and their knowledge as communist organizers, putting them to work. So it's like the underlying tone. You can also see it a lot with the commitments to building unions, the commitments to unity, and the commitments to struggle.
Thank you. I'm gonna check the online. Do we have another question? Or?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, and then we'll circle back here.
Kind of building off of the last question. I'm just curious, because I'm always fascinated with these periods of time where people were so invested in organizing, because they see a lot of people today who are similarly invested but don't have the same staying power.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about how you see social media playing a
Oh
role
my
with
God.
organizing, because I feel like it's such a distraction.
Mhm.
And kind of masquerades as a collective space against isolation and alienation, but interferes with genuine organizing.
Mhm.
So I'm curious how in that landscape, we cultivate a generation of like what you call long distance revolutionaries.
Mhm. Well, to keep it 100, we might be debating the merits of organizing from concentration camps, to quote Gerald Horne, very soon. I mentioned the McCarran Act. There is a provision in the McCarran Act that allows for the creation of security facilities, i.e. concentration camps in times of emergency. So they have these things called security index cards. A lot of people have them. Du Bois, most of the people in this book. And many of the provisions of the McCarran Act were like stricken down, like the passport provision. That was not. So I just want to put that out there. So pending that, I think you're absolutely right that social media is absolutely a distraction. I do think it can provide a space for persons who are not able-bodied, so people who are just able to participate in other types of ways. But I do think that it is a massive distraction, and there's so much destabilization and so much like psyops that actually do happen. We know this, right? That so many people come from the CIA to work for these social media platforms precisely to disrupt and destabilize. And so this is why it's, you hear people clamoring very loudly about not joining an organization and all this stuff. But when you're just out in the world, you don't necessarily hear that. And so there's a complete disjuncture between the online left and what seems to be the so-called discourse, but what seems to be actually happening. But those things then do carry over. And so I think that we just have to find a balance between being like analog, so being offline, but we can't simply concede the online space because of its sheer sort of power and ubiquity to like reaction. And so I think we have to find a balance. And then, obviously the pandemic like made things even more digitized, made things even, even more online. So I think, the US in particular, we're a very distracted society. We're the most highly propagandized society in the world, period. And, people try to say it's North Korea, but it's here. You think, freedom is like 33 toothpaste. Probably only need 1 or 2 kinds of toothpaste. But anyway, so I don't have a better answer other than that. But Jody, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, this is not in any way close to a better answer. It's just continuing along some of the themes you've outlined. I mean, we don't, like, if we're on roads, we can get tickets and cops surveil us. And so but we still use the roads. And so I think that we've got to think of digital media as like the roads. like, we don't really, if we're going to reach people, like if you're going to get somewhere, you got to go on a road. If you're going to reach some people, you're going to need to do it online, just like, you know, we've got some of tonight's event. So I think that the problem is if people think that the means of reaching people is the end in itself, if they take the just focus only on doing things with social media rather than actually on you know, actually, I mean, it's not organizing to just talk to people on social media. Organizing requires making sure that people will show up somewhere and do the things that you need, right? Getting a donation is not the same thing as organizing. So I think part of it is just putting social media in our correct perspective, and recognizing it's just a tool, and it's a tool with a lot of drawbacks, but but that's it.
Mhm.
Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. First of all, I want to thank you for this book. I think it's very important.
Can you just speak up a little?
I happen to be lucky enough to have worked with Esther Cooper Jackson and with Dorothy Burnham.
Mhm.
So I knew Esther not really well, but a little bit. Well, I worked with her on Freedom Ways.
Freedom Ways.
Um,
Gang, gang.
I wanted to say, just have one point of sort of historical information and a question. You mentioned Freedom newspaper, and Detroiters might be interested to know that Freedom was also almost a house organ of the National Negro Labor Council, which was
Get on the
which was
freedom
led-
train.
which was led by Coleman Young. My question though is, who was it that you wanted to have in this book that you didn't get to have?
It's a good question. So one like sort of glaring person I think is probably Shirley Graham Du Bois. Now, granted, I don't know. I'm ambivalent about Shirley. I think she was a hater. Like, I spent a lot of time in her papers there at the Radcliffe, and she was a hater. But she was brilliant, and she was in the thick of so much of this. And in fact, there is a letter in her papers that show that she is the reason that Du Bois ultimately joined the Communist Party, period. Like,
I thought that was kind of known, wasn't it?
yeah, I mean, but there, people are like, well, nah, there's a letter from Earl Browder,
Okay.
literally in the papers, that's like, and yeah, so anyway, so I think that's Shirley Graham Du Bois. Who else? She would be the main one. I'm trying to think about, I think it would have been interesting to have a piece from Queen Mother Moore, Audley Moore.
Sure.
That's the
She's
one.
so incredibly important. She's so dynamic. And she ended up leaving the Communist Party. She relatively early on, but she was important. I don't know that she did a whole lot of writing for any of the publications, but she certainly was an important person. What about you, Jody?
No, I was thinking Queen Mother Moore as well, and with that one that was complicated, in part because there wasn't actually a text that fit our bill that would work. And then we were going to need to do like maybe a transcript of an interview, which we weren't doing for other things. And then it was the complicated relation as she left the party, which is also super interesting, as Cherise said. So I think that was one that, yeah, I could have seen that one going in there. I mean, or that as a person that would have been important and representative. So that would, yeah, I agree with that.
One other person is Hermina Wiesvold. And interestingly, Hermina Wieswood is how I was pronouncing it till I met her nephew, and he's like, they were from Suriname, so they're like Dutch, right? And so she was the wife of Otto Wiesvold, and she was really good. Yeah, they're from Wiesvold. It's Dutch, So yeah, and so there's a man named Jibo Subukwe who's in my organization Black Alliance for Peace. That's actually her nephew, and so that's how you say it. And yeah, anyway, it's like Wiesvold. But super important, and she was in like the Harlem Tenements League and did a lot of upwork organizing work.
What was your negative considerations about Shirley Graham?
She just was a hater. Like, if you read her correspondence, she just had such a negative. And okay, here's my bias. So like, I love Dorothy Hunton, the wife of Althea Hunted. I just thought she was amazing for many reasons. And Shirley just was she just had so much smoke for Dorothy Hunton for no reason. I think that there was like some jealousy.
Yes, smoke for who?
Dorothy Hunton. I think, you know, everybody always talked about Dorothy Hunton's beauty. Like she was like very renowned for being very beautiful. And I think that Shirley was like, but no, she's wonderful. She's a complicated and sort of full figure, right? I think that she, yeah, it just, you know, whatever. There's just also some of her sort of interactions with Kwame Nkrumah were interesting to me. She just, you know, she was a person, but she was very smart, and I think her knowledge production is very important. And so I think we could do a second edition. She would be somebody that we might include.
And I thought about Mabel Williams, around the white. Mabel Gunn. Although I don't know if that fits into your timeline, but she starts around 1956 or 57.
That would be like right at the tail end. And was she in it, like in and or around the Communist Party? Because that's the other thing. These are like CPUSA and fellow traveler types.
I don't know. They had support in the CP. I don't know how connected they were.
That's something to look into.
But they, on the anti-imperialist front, you know, they did a lot of work. They competed with China.
Absolutely.
And in Detroit, when they moved, when they came back here, they lived up in northern, up in Iowa, Michigan. And continue to be active up there. But I really wanted to congratulate you on you and Professor. This is a great contribution.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Was there something over here?
Just thank you both. First of all, just listening and staring at the title, I'm just thinking like, again, kind of the first question, like, here we are now at the precipice of like abortion struggle, this tipping point of like all of the rights that the backbone of these women fought for could be completely on the chopping block. What do either of you care to say, or lessons you hope that we can pull out of this book regarding sort of like how to not end up in the same circle, but to go forward, you know, not be stuck in a loop?
Jody, you want to start?
I think the answer has got to be building unity. And I think the reason is that we can't fight against all of the taking away of rights that are going on from abortion to voting rights to even the right of a state like New York State lost the right to regulate guns, to the rights of the EPA to regulate in the environment. We can't oppose that if we are not unified. We cannot fight against that unless we are building mass movements and building strength together by recognizing that that struggles around Black liberation, women's liberation, and liberation from colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism are one struggle. And so I think that that's their lesson. And the thing is, the unity, in addition to being part of the struggle, is how they keep going. And they're going on during the Depression, during World War II, and in the McCarthy period, where the leaders are getting arrested, where they're constantly surveilled by the FBI. And so I think that the unity also helps you have the strength to keep going. And it lets you feel like, okay, I'm not in this alone. It's a long struggle, but as Cherie said earlier, we will win.
Yeah, same. Like, we continue. And this is dialectics, right? This is the dialectical unfolding. And so part of the reason why these women's struggle was so fierce was because times were bad. It was terrible. Things were not going well. And so so I don't know comparatively. And what we have to understand is that we are in a settler colony. A racial capitalist one built on enslavement, right? That's what 1776, what 400, I'm not that good at math, whatever, however, 300 something years old. And for the majority, and so the progressive era, not the progressive era of 1890, 1920, but the sort of liberal era, which spanned roughly 1954 to now, right? And in there was also McCarthyism, that is such a short period of US history. And so what this society does is constantly correct itself back to those basically fascist, basically right-wing roots, period. So that's what we have to understand, that history is on their side. And so that's what makes it all the more remarkable that so much of the progress that we made, and mind you, so much of that came from communist and socialist struggle. All of the labor rights we enjoy is just, it's just the state putting their stamp on it of those hard-earned things. And so it's just like, we continue, right? And at some point, we have to stop negotiating the terms of our immiseration, because you cannot rely on this law. You cannot rely on jurisprudence law to protect us, clearly, because it's wholly reversible,
Right.
even if it's codified in the Constitution. So at some point, we gotta, punto. So at some point, we gotta think.
Some questions here. With your strong emphasis on needing to join an organization, are there any multiracial organizations that you vouch for or would encourage folks to look into?
Jody, I'm in a Black organization, so.
Well, I'm in an interracial organization, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I would strongly encourage people to, look at PSL, look at PSLweb.org, look at Liberation News, you can send me an email, but PSL is a great organization that's committed to the things we've been talking about here tonight.
Let's see if I can get this. I need a mouse. What could this book teach us as the 21st century movement builders about the challenges and rewards of building multinational working class unity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something that we didn't emphasize as much in this particular talk, but all of these women are internationalists. They fundamentally understood as Jody did mention, the sort of interconnections of what's happening throughout the world to their realities in the United States. And so, internationalism is really, really important, because I take, the labor aristocracy seriously. So if we only struggle for particular nominal gains here in the United States, that's still built on the back of the expropriation and super exploitation of people in the global South. And so we have to, and Black people have if you take the work of Gerald Horne seriously, we've always had to organize internationally, because Black people have been historically second-class citizens at best. So we have always had to organize internationally. And the overwhelming majority of the world are workers, laborers, toilers. And so it's imperative that we connect up those struggles across borders, because that is I always say, the capitalists are internationalists. They know what it is. The borders are not stopping them, so they can't stop us, right?
And so, thank you, for that question. Faith is asking, this is primarily a nonfiction selection, which is great because we're a nonfiction niche. But she's interested to know what fiction influences you might have used.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have, go ahead, Jody. Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to mention not fiction influences, but the one set of fiction pieces we have. We have two articles from Alice Childress that were published in the Freedom newspaper, and that are from the perspective of a domestic worker, a Black woman named Mildred. And so she's a fictional character who is, explaining to her friend Marge, about something important. So one of the, she might talk about, essentially one of the pieces is about international labor and how workers from all over the world are making all the things around us. Another one is explaining the McCarthy era. And they're really nice essay, little articles, essays, because it lets you see how actually women, particularly Black women in the early 50s, were being reached by this magazine. Mary Helen Washington's in her book, The Other Blacklist, talks about these columns as some of the most important kinds of writing that were addressing Black women workers during the period. So those are the two that we have that are they're politically important, and they also have the kind of literary fictional quality that kind of incites the imagination a bit.
Yeah, I don't ever read any fictions ever, which I listen to the Audible sometimes, but it is very important. And excuse me, and there are short stories all throughout Freedom newspaper, and also like plays. Plays are really, really important because they're so there's this organization. This is sort of tangentially related to what we got going on, but there's this organization called El Proyecto, which was a sort of corollary to the Young Lords that was based in Puerto Rico, and they use a lot of like plays to dramatize concepts, right? To as tools of consciousness raising. So all of these sort of cultural products, if you will, are poems, like plays, fiction, are really, really important in terms of the types of sources you use for PE, for political education.
Perfect. So this is a last call for questions. Okay.
The excerpt from Thelma Dale that you read mentions an attack on voting rights, which is happening obviously now. And I feel like many young leftists don't see the value in voting. And I wonder just how you see voting fitting into current revolutionary movements and how we can learn from their experiences with it.
Go ahead, Jody. I'm going to reserve my comments on voting, rocking the vote. Go ahead, Jody.
The way I think about it is we shouldn't throw away anything that we have that lets us push back or fight back. And I also think we should not in any way fetishize voting or make voting the measure of somebody's politics. Like voting is, in the grand scheme of things, like at best a gateway drug to real politics. But I don't. Yeah, no, I'll leave with that.
Yeah, no, that was good. Couldn't have said it better.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing the book. We're celebrating the release this week, and we hope that if you're reading it, you'll encourage others to read it. I just want to remind everybody that that Dr. Burton Stully wrote is it W.E. Du Bois, A Life in American History with Dr. Gerald Horne, and is currently working on, so we're going to cross our fingers that we get a second event, okay, on
It's Black Scare, Red
Black
Scare.
Scare, Red Scare, Anti-Blackness, Anti-Communism, and the Rise of Capitalism in the United States. Okay. And
It's just called Black Scare, Red Scare now. There's nothing after the colon. Still figuring it out.
okay.
Yeah.
And Dr. Dean is author or editor of 13 different books.
14.
Now 14. And in 2016, Crowd and Party. And also Comrade, an essay on political belonging. Yes.
Umberto, get Comrade.
Nice. So do you have any last comment that you'd like to give?
Join an organization.
Okay.
A revolutionary organization.
Dr. Dean?
Oh, Sharice has the last word. I like that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, things that we do here at Source Booksellers for the audience, participants, people who have received so much, to give a little back to, this time, two people, one electronically and one right here in person. So I want everybody to think of something that you would say to that person.
I thought it was
Something
money.
short and sweet that you want her to hear. And you can shout it to each of the positions, the person here and the person on the screen. And when I count to three, you want to shower them with the words that you have. for them.
Okay, so whoever's online, you have the chat.
Yeah.
All right.
Waterfall in the chat.
Here we go.
Ready, 1, 2, 3.
Fido.
1, 2, 3. One more time. Come on. 1, 2, 3. You might want to wait just a minute to get the electronics out of the way, and then we have this for sale at the town.